establishing immediate flank pressure. This opening gambit seeks to control crucial central squares through indirect influence rather than direct confrontation. Symmetric pawn structures offer immediate challenges for control of central squares. Securing the center's influence and preparing for development, white contests central space. Establishing central influence and preparing piece development solidifies black's position against the English opening's flexibility. Preparing a kingside fianchetto to gain long-term diagonal pressure, reinforcing the central structure organically. Preparing the fianchetto to control the long diagonal, aiming for a solid pawn structure. Challenging the center immediately, white opens lines and prepares to dominate the core of the board. Opening that central d-file now directly challenges white's ambitious pawn structure and creates dynamic counterplay. Asserting central space and initiating a dynamic skirmish, the knight bravely ventures forward, challenging black's ambitious pawn structure. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately asserts pressure, eyeing white's central pawn and preparing for a more active role in the ensuing middle game. Repositioning the knight to b3 safeguards the pawn on c4 and prepares for expansion on the queen side. Developing this knight to its most active square reinforces black's central presence and prepares castling. Developing the bishop mirrors black's plan, reinforcing control of key diagonals and preparing for castling in this symmetrical English opening structure. Securing the monarch is paramount, freeing the queen and potentially preparing kingside expansion. Reinforcing the d4 square solidifies central control and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to challenge the center's dominance feels natural here. Anchoring your king safely is paramount in this symmetrical structure, preparing for middle game skirmishes. Developing a piece to a useful square, this bishop now supports the d6 pawn and eyes the queenside. Exploiting the central pawn chain's vulnerability, this gambit seeks to seize initiative and disrupt black's development. Securing central space now creates a solid pawn chain, challenging white's immediate queenside pressure. Aggressively pinning the knight immediately pressures black's center and limits their development options. Shattering the center's grip, black decisively advances, seizing crucial central space and opening lines for his pieces. Unleashing the knight towards the queenside creates immediate pressure on black's advanced d-pawn and eyes potential outpost opportunities. Challenging the bishop's pinning power, this pawn push probes white's knight outpost and subtly prepares for future queenside expansion. Realigning the bishop to a more active diagonal clears the way for queenside expansion. Repositioning the bishop to d5 initiates a clever maneuver, aiming to exchange it for white's strong knight on b5 and disrupt white's queenside pressure. A bold knight sacrifice, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and open lines towards the vulnerable monarch. Exchanging the bishop on g2 initiates a positional simplification, potentially clarifying the pawn structure for both sides. Safely tucking the monarch away addresses immediate king safety, but relinquishes central control and simplifies black's position. Unleashing a swift check, black disrupts white's king safety and initiates a likely tactical sequence. Chasing that disruptive queen across the board, white repositions the knight to support the central pawn structure and prepare for further development. Shifting the queen to the queenside aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities. Unlocking the queenside's potential, white aims to seize central initiative and press the initiative forward. Simplifying the position, black trades queens, aiming to exploit the open files and potentially pressure white's uncastled king in the upcoming endgame. Opening the e-file grants access to potential pawn pushes and piece activity in the center. Commanding the open d-file with the rook significantly enhances black's piece activity and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Opening up the d-file creates immediate tension and potential for central pawn breakthroughs, forcing black to address the pawn chain. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure, A5 aims to disrupt white's control and potentially create attacking chances. Solidifying the pawn structure creates a robust central shield, though it slightly restricts the queen's bishop. A daring knight maneuver, seeking to disrupt white's central grip and inject life into black's piece play. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the remaining pieces for active play. A bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's central control and activate the knight toward the queenside. Simplifying the queenside structure, white initiates a simplification that could lead to an endgame advantage through a clear pawn majority. Prying open the queenside, black opens a path for the rook to exploit the a-file. Rallying the rook to the open file asserts control and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Repositioning the rook to the open file exerts pressure and prepares for potential pawn advances down the queenside. Opening the central file for rook infiltration, aiming to exploit black's slightly cramped queenside. This pawn advance aims to expand black's queenside space, preparing for future pressure. Pushing the pawn further aims to restrict black's queenside mobility and potentially create a passed pawn, but it also weakens white's king's safety significantly. Pivoting the rook to the open file aims to build pressure on white's queenside pawn structure, but consider whether this rook is better placed supporting a kingside advance or defending the d-pawn. Initiating a pawn advance to seize greater space and potentially isolate black's queenside structure. Asserting control over the open file, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and gain active piece play. Controlling the open file becomes paramount with this maneuver. Securing the e5 outpost and preparing for the coming pawn storm presents a solid positional choice. Shifting the king to f1 subtly prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside while reinforcing the d-file. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the long diagonal enhances black's queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Shifting the king towards the action aims to activate this piece for the endgame skirmish and prepare for pawn advances. Repositioning the bishop to d8 solidifies the queenside structure and prepares for potential pawn advances while aiming to trade off white's active pieces. Consolidating the rook presents a solid defensive stance, fortifying the d4 pawn and preparing for a potential endgame grind. This maneuver endeavors to activate the rook on the queenside, aiming for counterplay against white's advanced pawns. Reinforcing the central d-file with the rook, preparing to challenge black's activity on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn. Repositioning the bishop to the center creates a strong defensive anchor and prepares to contest the semi-open file. The king's venture into the center begins, seeking active participation. Initiating a pawn raid on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances. King's central march begins, aiming to exploit the open files and create an active endgame presence. This maneuver aims to centralize the rook, preparing for potential action on the d-file or a swift repositioning to support the kingside pawns. Reclaiming the knight from its outpost allows for a potential regrouping to challenge black's queenside pawn chain. Suddenly disrupting white's solidified center with a pawn thrust, this move aims to inject immediate chaos and tactical possibilities into the position. Relocating the king to a more active, central square opens up possibilities for pawn advances and potential endgame maneuvering. Unleashing a pawn break in the center, this pawn advances, potentially disrupting white's queenside space and opening critical lines for black's active pieces. Sacrificing a pawn here opens the d-file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially create counterplay in a tense endgame. Reclaiming the central file offers a glimmer of counterplay amidst the constricted queenside. Unleashing a knight from its centralized post, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize more space on the queenside. Reactivating the bishop's influence on the kingside might deter white's encroaching knights. Repositioning the king to a safer square, away from the central fray. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's central control and prepare for counterplay on the king side. Reclaiming the d-file offers central control and prepares for a pawn push or piece regrouping. Exchanging the rooks might be premature, potentially allowing white to exploit the open d-file. Consolidating the king is paramount now that the queens are off, aiming to secure it on its new central outpost. The king liberates itself, seeking active squares and supporting its pawns in this endgame. Repositioning the monarch toward the center is crucial for an active endgame. Activating the king is essential now, aiming for central influence and potential outpost support on squares like e5 or d5. Consolidating your king's position will be crucial as the queens exit the board and the pawn structure opens up. The black king ventures aggressively forward, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. The king's exposed position now faces immediate disruption, forcing a tactical retreat to maintain material balance. The black king drifts into a dangerous central position, inviting further pressure. Consolidating the king's presence in the center aims to influence the critical d5 square and discourage pawn advances. Shifting the bishop to f6 aims to secure this piece, anticipating a potential exchange and improving its defensive posture against white's encroaching king. Recentralizing the knight aims to improve its defensive capabilities and potentially redeploy it to a more active square. Seizing the b2 pawn unravels black's queenside pawn structure, creating immediate weaknesses. Snapping up the pawn, white disrupts black's queenside structure and claims an isolated weakness. Capturing the bishop finally releases white's knight to patrol the central squares. Capturing the pawn on b2 solidifies white's central pawn majority and begins a king march to control open lines. The black king marches, seeking refuge from the outpost while white's knight seeks an opportunity. The monarch bravely ventures forward, seeking to dominate the center and pressure the isolated pawns. Repositioning the rook opens the e-file, creating a vital outpost for kingside pressure. Recapturing that pawn opens a diagonal for the rook to pressure black's isolated queenside pawns. Reclaiming the central files is paramount after your opponent's rook maneuver. Securing the open file with the rook allows for potential pressure on the pawn and better defensive coordination. Repositioning the bishop to *f6 prepares to challenge white's advanced central pawn and eyes the d4 square for potential pawn advances later. Repositioning the knight to c1 offers defensive solidity and prepares a potential regrouping on the queen side. Re-establishing the rook on the central file, this pawn push threatens immediate penetration. Repositioning the knight to threaten weaknesses on the queen side is a proactive idea. The rook's foray to the first rank is a bold attempt to disrupt white's king's safety amidst this endgame tangle. The king's perilous journey across the board must now find a safer haven before the rook cuts off its escape. The rook's repositioning to the open file now targets white's isolated pawns, creating immediate dynamic possibilities. Exploring the d-file for potential breakthroughs, this king maneuver aims to solidify central control and prepare for further operations. A forceful check, forcing the enemy king to shift and potentially exposing its defenses further. Reinforcing that strong knight outpost on b4 now aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and control central squares. Securing the bishop's outpost at d4 significantly pressures white's remaining pawns and opens lines for black's rook. The white king scrambles for safety as the rook continues its infiltration. The bishop retreats to bolster the kingside defense, preserving the piece for future maneuvering in this tense endgame. Opening a decisive path for the rook to penetrate black's defenses. Opening the a-file with the pawn capture grants immediate counterplay, disrupting white's control over the crucial open column. Unleashing the knight's fork across the board, securing an immediate material advantage by exploiting the exposed king. The king's exposed position now grants the opposing rook a path to attack. Reclaiming the outpost with the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for an assault on the queen side. The bishop bravely ventures forward, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and create outpost opportunities for the knight. Repositioning the knight to its ideal outpost promises significant pressure on black's queenside pawns. The black king, now exposed, must find a safe haven as the knight prowls aggressively. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to influence the central pawn structure.